I'm Lynda Wright, librarian at Randolph-Macon College. Today is October 25th, and we're doing Macon Memories. And I'm here with Professor George Oliver and Professor James Scanlon.
And I'm George Oliver. I came to Randolph-Macon as a student in 1943, spent a year here, went in the Navy, came back in 46, and graduated in 49. I came back on the faculty here in 1950 and stayed on until retirement in 1992.
I'm James Scanlon. I was hired by George Oliver in 1968. I was still in graduate school at the time. I came to teach in September of 1968, and I retired from full-time teaching in 2004. I've continued to teach one course a semester until this year, and I'm now working on the second volume of the history of the college. George, I wonder if you would tell posterity. And why should we do anything for posterity? What has posterity ever done for us? I want you to tell posterity the wonderful story of Igor Stravinsky's son, who was having breakfast with you and your daughters.
Yes, I was living, my wife and I and our two daughters were living at 310 North Center Street, which was the old Blackwell House. And Suleiman Stravinsky came here to perform. He was a pianist. And one morning we had invited him in for breakfast. It was sort of the informal nature of the college back in those days. Well, our daughters, who were just very small children at that time, 3 or 4 years old, liked to pretend that they were cats. And so they came crawling into the dining room that morning on all fours, insisting that my wife give them a bowl of milk on the floor. So I don't know what Mr. Stravinsky thought of the whole operation, but he took it in good stead.
Did we not have other famous guests? Did we not have other famous guests? I remember Margaret Mead coming here a couple of times, and she always had a big staff. She called it a thumb staff for support. And Merrill Munyon used to refer to her as Bo Peep because of the staff. Who else did we have? Oh, the English poet, W.H. Auden. He was the personal friend of Bill Gray, the professor of English, and actually came at least twice to Randolph-Macon and stayed in Bill Gray's apartment. But we seemed in the 60s and 70s to have more famous guests than we do today. I mean, absolutely top-of-the-line people.
Because there were people here like Bill Gray who had these connections. And actually, we used to laugh at Dr. Moreland because he would talk about his warm personal friends. But some of his warm personal friends were people who were well known. And I'm thinking, for example, of Bishop Barbieri, who was, I think, from Latin America, from not Portugal, from Porto Alegre, where Dr. Moreland had been president. And so we did have some rather important people to come here.
George, speaking of Moreland, how did he describe Foxhall? Do you remember his architectural description?
Yes, I remember that very well. We had a rather outspoken woman who lived adjacent to the college named Mary Bailey Ragland. Her father had been on the faculty here, and she was head of the French department, I think, at one of the high schools in Richmond. But Mary Bailey did have a sharp tongue, and she accosted Dr. Moreland one day about Foxhall. And she said, "Dr. Moreland, you know that has no reason to exist because it's a monstrosity." He said, "Mary Bailey, you just do not understand." He said, "It is Tudor, colonial, modern." And
do you have other Moreland stories?
Well,
remember the Pulaski story?
Are you talking about the name of Pulaski, or the story about the
Moreland driving through it?
Well, I remember the story about him getting up at the top of a mountain. This was Lambeth Clark's story. Okay. Getting up on top of a mountain and shifting into neutral. And he said, "I'll be cheating the gas company," as he sailed down the road. course, Lambeth had a large number of stories. Lambeth, as you know, was the president of Virginia Wesleyan for a number of years, and
before that
he was assistant. He was assistant to the president here, but he did tell the story of of mentioning a young man to Dr. Moreland, who a divinity student, and Dr. Moreland said, Lambeth, he said, I have had a great deal of trouble with that young man. He gambles. Well, Lambeth said that he just couldn't believe it because he knew the boy, and he accosted the boy himself, and he said, I would like to ask you a direct question, but I don't know quite how to phrase it, but did you ever gamble? And he said the young man paled and said, Mr. Clark, you know I wouldn't do anything like that. But Dr. Moreland would get things in his head. In fact, he even gave me a particular position. He said, George Oliver, here is my official critic. And that was something that had been suggested by Schuyler Miller, of course.
Well, I was told that Moreland used to invite all the faculty malcontents, and I assume you were one of them, to go off to dinner every so often.
Yes, Dick Wood and Burnell Pannell and I were invited by Dr. Moreland to go to his club one day. And we were there with Reeves Childs. And Dr. Moreland said to us as we got in there, he said, now, Reeves, I have some bourbon in my locker here for you, but the rest of you, those of you on the faculty, can't have anything. So he was, I think, trying to live up to the reputation of the college as being a college without alcohol.
In one of the yearbooks from the 1950s or early 60s, there were pictures of students holding beer cans, and Moreland hired a professional artist to airbrush stripes on the cans so that to the untutored eye it looked like they were holding Dixie cups. But Dixie cups tapered, and these were parallel sides, so they were beer cans. And is Moreland the one responsible for our cup rule, that if you're drinking out of a plain cup, the college doesn't ask you what's in it?
I don't remember that, but when my wife and I were young on the faculty and staff, we were asked to chaperone parties at the Lambda Chi House. And my rule with them was that I wanted to see absolutely no bottles. If I saw them, I would pitch them out. But if someone came downstairs with a bottle with a kind of an amber-colored liquid, with a glass, I would assume that it was ginger ale and not say anything about it. But at that point, officially, the college was alcohol-free, and you weren't supposed to have any.
What was the Latin phrase? Videre quam esse?
Oh, yes, to seem rather than to be, yeah.
Which was a play on the motto.
On the motto, yes.
To be, not rather than to seem.
Indeed, indeed.
I have one Moreland story, and I think it may be my favorite next to the Fox Hall story. It comes from Lambeth Clark. Lambeth and Moreland were driving in southwestern Virginia, and they went through Pulaski. And Moreland said, Pulaski, wasn't he a great Indian warrior? And Lambeth Clark said, no, Dr. Moreland, Pulaski was a Polish soldier who fought with the Americans during the Revolution. And Moreland, who was never wrong, said, that was the other one.
I remember that now that you tell it. I had forgotten it, though.
Do we want to talk about Flavia Owen now?
Yes.
George?
No, go ahead.
Well, I think one of the smartest things I ever did when I came to Randolph-Macon, purely as a matter of courtesy, was to come over and introduce myself to Flavia Owen. And she was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful librarian, immensely intelligent. She graduated from college, the Randolph-Macon Women's College, at age 19. She had her master's in library science at age 21, and she came here, I think, in 1941 or 1940.
It would have been before I came here
as librarian. And the library at that time was what is now Peel Hall, and it was a dreadful building as a library. George, can you tell us about it?
Well, when you entered the library from either the campus or the Henry Street side, you had to go up a flight of stairs to what was the main body of it, where there was a circulation desk and various reference books. If you wanted to see other parts of the library, you had to go down some very narrow stairs in another part of the reading room. And then if you wanted history, say, you had to go all the way to the basement. And unfortunately, that was fairly low, Ashland being a rather humid climate. And so it was hard to keep the books from being from mildewing. But Jim was just saying that Flavia came here in the early 40s. And the one job that I had was that as a student assistant in the library. And so the jobs that we had as student assistants was to man the circulation desk in the evening. And so she hired me. And so that was my first contact with Flavia. I mean, obviously from then on I had a very close relationship to her because Flavia was very interested in trying to make a truly meaningful collection for the college library. And the only thing was that sometimes she threw away some books. And I can remember the famous confrontation between Flavia and Merrill Munyon, because Merrill did not want anything thrown away, absolutely nothing. But Flavia insisted that some things had to go. So I think they really had words over this business.
Not only that, but Merrill lived in a faculty apartment in a white frame building very close to Fox Hall. And that building was torn down to build the Walter Hines Page Library. And somebody told me that Merrill never forgave Flavia for tearing down his house to build her library. But Flavia was the librarian when the Walter Hines Page Library was built. Her husband was an architectural engineer, and I don't know who the architectural firm was who designed the Walter Hines Page Library, but it was a wonderful building. It was a delightful building. It did not have air conditioning, and that was its great flaw. But there were enormous windows on the south and north sides that ran the whole height of the building, which slid open. They slid horizontally. And so on nice days, you could open them up, and there would be this gale that would run through the building. And then the stacks were in the center of the building, and so there was a balcony on each side of the stacks over on the second floor, overlooking the first floor study spaces. There was a beautiful special collections room. There was a beautiful Dodd room, both of them lit by skylights. William Dodd was the first professor of history here, and when he died, he left his collection of books here. He didn't stay at Randolph-Macon. He was a professor of history at University of Chicago. And he also was U.S. ambassador to Germany in the 1930s. So it was quite a stroke that he left his books to us. And it was a wonderful collection. It's since been broken up and just put into the regular history collections. But it was a lovely, lovely, lovely building, aesthetically very pleasing and also very functional. Unfortunately, the college outgrew it. And so in the mid-'80s, we got a grant from June McGraw-Macon, who later joined the Board of Trustees. And she gave $2 million, I think. Is it $2? To expand this building. And so the entranceway was, which had been on the street, was replaced by that tower, and the entrance was put on the side of the building, which at this point has now become the middle of the building. But I think Flavia's library, to the extent that she influenced its design, and I think she probably did, was a very, very superior building, very attractive. Do you want to talk about Merrill Munyon?
Well, Merrill Munyon was a history professor here, and known popularly among the students as Mumbles Munyon, because his diction was not always entirely clear. But he was a New Englander. He had gone to Wesleyan University, and so everything was judged by Wesleyan. If it would fit, it was fine. If it didn't fit, then it wasn't something that we should be doing. He was also a very strict grader. The only thing was that Merrill rarely got around to grading his papers. And I can remember so well because I had a class with him in the last year that I was here before I went off to graduate school. And when I came back, we were going to a faculty dinner one night, and Merrill came up beside me, and he said, "I don't want you to say you never got your papers back," and handed me one that I'd written about 4 or 5 years before then. But Merrill was an interesting person. I always felt that he, probably more than anybody here at Randolph-Macon, prepared me for graduate school because of his exacting standards, even though he didn't get his papers back. And he also was very generous about the use of the home that he eventually bought after he was evicted from this apartment that Jim was telling about. But he bought the rectory of the former Episcopal Church when the Episcopal Church moved away from Center Street. And, of course, there was still a kind of a large open space with a stage. It was an auditorium, yeah. And he let the Walter Hines Page Club use this as a place for their programs. And the Washington Literary Society, yes. So he was very generous with that.
And he had an enormous collection of books on British history.
Yes, he did. Merrill never got his Ph.D. He was one of these people who never went beyond a bachelor's degree. But there was a reason for it. The reason was that he was so exacting, he never thought that he had crossed the last T or dotted the last I. And he had done his graduate work at Duke, and one of the professors at Duke once said to me that this was Munyon's style. If he was assigned the job of counting the fleas on an elephant, instead of doing what almost anybody else would do, which was to mark out a certain section of the elephant, figure the total space the elephant's hide encompassed, and then multiply to get the number of fleas. He said no. Munyon would sit there day after day after day and count exactly the number of fleas on that elephant. And that described him pretty well. So that was it. He never got his even his master's degree. And I think that was the result of that was that when I went through Duke, you couldn't go as a candidate for the Ph.D. unless you got your master's degree, because he felt the department felt that it hadn't been quite right for Merrill to do this. But he's an interesting man to have around.
George, do you want to talk about the student unrest around the time of Kent State, or do you want me to talk about it?
Why don't you do it, and
Then you can add. Well, it's very vivid in my mind because it happened in my second year of teaching, and things when you're new are much more striking. But I don't recall anything like it here at Randolph-Macon in the last nearly 40 years. In April of 1970, President Nixon ordered what he called an incursion into Cambodia. And I was working late in my office because I was working on lectures, and one of the students came in and said, "I'm very upset about this. I want to talk to you. Nobody is interested in it in the dorms." And so we talked. And then, of course, in early May, there were the protests at Kent State University in Ohio, which resulted in the National Guard shooting and killing a number of protesters. That provoked a nationwide outcry among students. At Randolph-Macon, there was a memorial service in Duncan Chapel for the students killed at Kent State. I went. My recollection is there were about 36 students there. It was very sparsely attended. The following weekend was Camptown weekend, and there were races a few miles away from here on a track that was used one day a year, horse races. And 15,000 people would come to them. It was enormously popular, and the students would get very wrapped up in them, and there were many parties before and after the races. and a great deal of drinking. Well, come the following week, the students just broke out of all control and were agitating that they wanted to shut the college down so they could go to Washington and protest the war. I just finished reading the draft of History of Georgetown in the 20th century, and if I remember it correctly, Georgetown University was forced to shut down at this period. Other large universities like Yale were forced to shut down. And the students wanted just to shut the school down here. And Blackwell Auditorium was just crammed with students. And whatever the capacity is, it was 500 and some, it was just filled with students who were chanting and jeering and making a great deal of noise. I remember seeing small groups of students huddled together, whispering to each other in an agitated way in front of the library, a thing I've never seen since. And I know that I spent, I want to say 2 or 3 nights at the Fountain Plaza until 1 o'clock in the morning talking to students. And I wasn't the only one. There were men, I don't know if you were, George was there, other people were there. And I remember calling students by name, saying, now look here, Nelson, what you're saying isn't true. And the point I want to stress is that because of the small size of the college, there was a lot more communication. And I remember Professor McClurkin making a comment in the faculty meeting where he said a student told him, if anybody strikes a match, there will be 5 students who will try to put it out. But it was a very, very, very tense time. And Howard Davis had just been appointed dean to take effect that summer. And Howard went around with an idea that students could defer their final examinations, which were going to happen in a week or so, and take them by the end of September of the following fall. And so if the students really felt serious about protesting the war and going to Washington, they could sort of take incompletes and finish up the following fall. And that idea was accepted by the faculty. It was accepted, again, by one of these enormous meetings of students after a lot of tumult. The students were very, very close to striking. And they were just about ready to vote for it. And there was a sophomore, and I'll never forget this, and I didn't know him. I got to know him later, named Peter Benovich. And Peter was in the balcony and yelled out, "What you're doing isn't fair. We need to have a regular vote and a ballot." And I thought it was one of the most courageous things I've ever seen, because he stood up to 500 other students. And it turns out, after graduation, he became a fighter pilot, I think, in the United States Marines or in the Navy. Then went on to sell real estate, but a tremendous personal courage at that moment. And so it all blew over. And in the end, not very many students took the option of deferring finals. And I think it was, in many cases, students who were in academic trouble, and this got them some time. But the point I want to make is that Randolph-Macon did not close, and a lot of the bigger universities did because of the close faculty-student involvement. I don't recall seeing many administrators out there.
Well, that was one point that I would make, and that is the president did not appear, as far as I can recall. I don't know about any of the deans. You did mention Howard, and he wasn't dean then, but he was. And there was some talk among the more militant of the students about actually torching the place. My argument with them was that the college, any college, was one of the few places left in our society at that time where there could be a discussion of issues. And one of the things that I sort of enjoyed participating in was a teach-in one day. And I was able to say something about the nature of the background for the war in Vietnam and how it had come on gradually without exactly much planning or anticipation. But it was probably the one issue that really riled the students in a way which I have never seen them hear before. And I remember that I was at Duke at a time when the Duke Power Company raised the price for the bus that went from one campus to the other. And that was the one time at Duke that I ever saw any agitation for anything, because they were very much unhappy about it. I don't know whether Duke had anything to do with the Vietnam War or not.
The teach-in that you referred to, that was and I've just been reading about this, so it's fresh in my mind. There was supposed to be a national moratorium, and all students were supposed to take off a day. That was in October of 1969. And I remember speaking in Blackwell Auditorium, either in May or but I think in October. I was supposed to be part of a panel of professors to talk about the war, and everybody bailed out except me. I was very disappointed. And so I gave an address. A conservative looks at the war, and I had a lot of, as I remember, quotations from Edmund Burke and John Randolph in my scholarly way. But it was very well received by the students. And like George, I held classes that day, but I let the class discuss what they want to discuss, as long as it had to do with history. And, of course, the war was part of history. So it was very scary. It was very scary. We didn't know what was going to happen. And the students' emotions were very raw and very deep. And when you get 500 of them together, it could be troublesome. There were people, young men in the English department who weren't coming back, who seemed to have a lot of influence over the students, professors, I mean, who seemed, I think, to be encouraging this sort of thing, but in the end urged the students to accept the faculty compromise, and the students did. And I really think it saved us from an awful lot of trouble. There were occasional students from other campuses, I think, coming by, and there were students yammering about the movement. But our students are surprisingly clannish, and I think they got rid of these people. Who are you, and why are you here? And, you don't belong here. Our students wanted it to be on their own terms. George, there's something about a student letter encouraging integration. That happened in the mid-'60s before I got here.
All right. You did not attend, then, that famous faculty meeting in the science building of the faculty?
Science building. Well, this was before the current science building.
Before the current science building.
I wasn't here.
You weren't here, but we did have a meeting in what was then the science building, and the new one, that is, which has now been incorporated into the larger Smithy. But we did have a faculty meeting, which was unofficial, and we passed a resolution which, in effect, said we did not have confidence in the administration on the matter of racial integration. And Dr. Moreland took one look at it, and he said, we can't count this because the meeting was held during a period when the college was not in session. Now, eventually, a group of trustees looked at the charter of the college and came to the conclusion that there was nothing in the charter to say that blacks could not attend Randolph-Macon. And so the decision was made to integrate. And the only casualty that I know of was the publisher of the newspaper in Roanoke, Virginia, who said that he would have to drop out of the trustee board. Eventually, however, he gave a rather large amount of money to the college, so he was reconciled to the situation. But I think what you're talking about is that unofficial meeting, which Dr. Moreland said had no status because of the fact that it was during a time off.
After the school officially became integrated, Were there very many African American students who came?
Very few, very few. In fact, we have never really had, well, Jim, you know from the college history, I guess something about the percentage, perhaps. I don't know what is the largest percentage of black students we've ever had.
I think it runs around 6%, perhaps.
Yeah, it's never been very large.
But I mean, immediately, were there any black students who came?
There were a few who came. I would say we got 3 or 4, perhaps, who came in the first batch. It was not widely publicized, I think, for one thing.
George, do you want to talk about going co-ed?
All right, well, that had been discussed for some time, and I think that was accomplished without any real adverse reaction from either faculty, students, or members of the Board of Trustees. Now, I can speak briefly to what they meant to the campus. The first group of students, we accepted 50 to begin with, and that was widely publicized, and it was widely known that this is what we were doing. This was a very select group of young women, and they have just done marvelously if you look at their accomplishments. One that I can think of who was here over homecoming has been a very successful banker. I can think of at least 2 who have been very highly respected physicians. And I'm sure if I looked at the rest of the young women who came in here, they would fit into that category. What has always struck me is that it was widely predicted that because the young women would be in awe of their male classmates, that they wouldn't say anything in class. Well, my experience was that they not only said a great deal, but talked more than the men did. The other thing was that for many of those years, I was the secretary of the Phi Beta Kappa chapter here, and when you looked at the list of Phi Betas at the end of any given year, you would find that anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of the people elected to Phi Beta Kappa were women. So I used to say to the men, this should shame you because you should go out and see if you can't at least achieve equality. But they didn't do that. And so I really just don't remember any agitation or any now, I know we made mistakes. I mean, I can remember the famous problem of the shower curtains because they didn't think to put shower curtains in the bathrooms. And, of course, the women didn't want gang showers the way the men had been accustomed to. So that's one thing that I remember. But otherwise, I don't really recall any major problems.
It's a curious story. According to the trustee minutes, Luther Wright suggested considering going coeducational in his first fall, 1967. Nothing came of it. The board seemed very much opposed to it. Luther seemed to be very much opposed to it as time went on. The reason we went co-ed was, frankly, to get students. It wasn't an ideological commitment. Randolph-Macon's commitment to the education of women was, of course, the Women's College, which was set up in the 1890s, which has now gone co-ed just this year. It's now Randolph College. In the spring semester of 1971, there were something like 704 students. In the fall semester, we had, if I remember correctly, 3 of the motel dormitories boarded up. So we were really losing students. No one knew why. I think in 70, 71, or 69, 70, 100 students left, 25 flunked out, 25 finished their degree requirements, and 50 left just for no reason, really clear reasons. There was a commission on enrollment appointed by the president in 1970. I was not one of the original members, but somehow I got on it because I see my name in the final group. That group really didn't do anything, and one day in December of 1970, Howard Davis called us into his conference room and said, "Gentlemen, here is your report." And it ran to several pages. I think there were 9 items, and only one of which was number 7, was coeducation. The rest had mainly to do with bringing the college closer to the Methodist Church and all sorts of things. I'm so sorry Howard Davis has died for many reasons, but one of the reasons is I could have found out whether he wrote it or Luther White wrote it. I think Luther White wrote it. And Howard Davis said, there are a lot of things in here, and it's the things that have been itching the president, and this is his way of scratching it. And in effect, if you want to have coeducation, then you have to accept the whole package. And we did. And it was presented to the faculty not for a vote, but just for information. And then it went to the Board of Trustees, and they adopted it in February or January of 1971. And so the poor director of admissions had to gear up a campaign to recruit women students at the end of the recruiting season.
And the people that he brought in ultimately were the 50 group that came in. It was a very distinguished group of young women. We haven't said anything yet about World War II and its effect on the college. And, of course, I was very much involved in that because I came here as a student in 1943. At that time, we had what we call an ASTP unit on campus, Army Specialized Training Program, which was pulled out in the spring of 1944. And that left fewer than 50 students. Jim, do you remember the exact number? And,
I don't.
but I think it was fewer than as far as the undergraduates, maybe 50. A lot of those, I'd say up to 20 of them may have been women. And they were women who lived in the town, and therefore the college did not have any responsibility for them. One of the fraternity houses was turned over to them for a kind of a social place, which was called the Skirt Barn. Then, in talking about the expansion of the college, of course, things did not improve much until the end of the war in 1945, and most of us did not get out in time to re-enter college in the fall of 45. So most of us came back in in the fall term of 1946. That meant a tremendous increase in the number of students, and all the dormitories were full, all the fraternity houses were full, and a lot of us had to live in town in rooms that we hired. So the college survived the war, but it was a touch-and-go situation, I think, for a long time. Fortunately, the faculty was not large, and the faculty began to increase in numbers. I was hired in 1950, and I was the third person in the history department at that point. There was Alec Mabry, Merrill Munyon, and then I came in. But did you want to say anything about World War II?
Not about World War II, but you reminded me something very important about going coeducation. It presented not a problem for the faculty, it was an enormous problem for Luther White. He was the last of the Victorians. He could not bring himself to say the word sex in public. And he said, and I heard him say it, if men go into the women's dormitories, the women will be in danger of losing their identities. And he insisted on having parietal hours, and it created an enormous amount of resentment among the students.
Yes. And also, he really was very uneasy about having women faculty members. And so at least in the early stages of hiring women, I think Luther tried to think of ways in which he could prevent tenure for them.
Didn't he prevent tenure for Penny Bledsoe?
Penny Bledsoe. And some of the other early ones, B.J. Seymour, for example. I don't know whether B.J. said anything about this in her session the other day. But Luther really, he knew he had to give tenure to them, but he was very unhappy about doing it.
Thank you so much. We just have a couple of minutes left if you want to have any summarizing thoughts.
Well, I have seen the college through thick and thin. There was a time, I think, when many of us felt the college might not even survive financially. And now we seem to have a president who has his finger on some money and who is very much interested in the continuation of the college. He's got some ideas that he's working on, and Jim knows more about them than I do because I'm not on campus.
Not I, no.
But he certainly impresses me as a man of vigor and one who has certainly the best interests of the college at heart.